Have you ever frozen in the key moment of making a critical decision? Whether it's in business or in life, it can cost you everything. Commander's Intent will teach and inspire you how to lead with clarity, courage, and purpose. So here's your host, retired Air Force Colonel, fighter pilot, and your leadership mentor, Derek Oates.
Hello, I'm Derek Oates, and welcome to Commander's Intent. I've got my good friend here with me, Retired General Mike Minihan. So good to see him.
Good to see you,
We're
brother.
here in the great Salt Lake Basin, and we're going to talk about aviation. We're going to talk about leadership, and we're going to talk, you see behind us, we're in Sluggo Hussar's little aviation museum here.
Thank you, Sluggo.
He was so nice to let us use his facility, and so that it would just cause us to talk about aircraft, even if we weren't going to talk about aircraft here. And we're here at an interesting time. The Air Force is getting ready to hire, the National Command Authority is getting ready to hire a new Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Looks like it's going to be General Kenneth Wilsbach, who's coming out of retirement. I don't know him, but the two brothers in the room here with me do know him and have worked with him before. I've heard nothing but good about him, but I heard nothing but good about the last Chief of Staff, General Alvin also, and the one prior to that, C.Q. Brown. The big question is going to be, how does General Wilsbach take over as Chief of Staff, and what is his commander's intent? As I look at the Air Force, and if anybody reads things that I write, you know that I am not all that laudatory about where we are as an Air Force. And that's not just the General Officer Corps' fault, but it's where we are, and it's something that needs to be fixed and fixed dramatically. And it's not just for the combat air forces or the mobility air forces, it's across the board in terms of capacity and capability. And so I'm going to let Mike kind of do an intro here a little bit about what he thinks about it, and then we'll go from there.
Certainly. Hey, thanks for having me. It's a treat. We served together in the same squadron at the very beginning of our career, so it's cool to be back. And I've got gray hair. You need to work on that.
I got a haircut to kind of hide the gray hair.
I listened to General Wilsbach's testimony this morning on the flight here from Tampa. And, it was, a pretty straightforward testimony. I too have concerns about the Air Force. I voiced them very strongly. I didn't wait to have an opinion until I retired. So, at the end of the day, simplified, I believe that the Air Force needs to generate the readiness to fight China now. And that in order to base your future plans, it has to be grounded in what you can really do now. And, this gets to, I think, what you appropriately call the how you get things done. We've got great documents and visions that somehow lack the follow through, lack the how, lack what I call generating the readiness. At the end of the day, this Air Force is not the most, we should not ground ourselves on being the best Air Force in the world. We've got to ground ourselves on being the most lethal force the planet has ever known. I mean, that's what true air power brings to the joint force, to the coalitions, to the global good. We are the most lethal force on the planet. And we've got some work to do to maintain that. So this country needs to either pay for the Air Force it needs or live with the Air Force it pays for. And those are two different futures, one of them good and one of them bad. So at the end of the day, this new chief has got to win resourcing battles. I don't think that we've been successful in the resourcing discussions. I'm not certain that Congress has been understanding our vision. We can't walk away from those conversations saying they just don't get it, because if they don't get it, we don't get the resourcing. And so this battle in the future for Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Wilsbach, is going to be about winning resourcing discussions. And that's going to set him apart from his predecessors, I think.
I think you're spot on. I've said over and over, we get so hung up on air power terms and speaking in these lofty, I'd like to explain it to you, but you're not going to understand it, kind of a term. And I'm an air power advocate. I've been an air power agent for my entire adult life. And yet sometimes I get a little lost in what comes out of, Air University about the terms. I'm like, just talk to the soldier, talk to the airman, and talk to that congressman who can barely do his lap belt. When he gets on an airplane, he doesn't know anything about it. And I say that kind of disparagingly, but I'm really just saying that they're not air power experts, and we don't talk to them in a common language too often. And as a result, they don't get it and understand the tremendous value that air power brings.
Yeah, it's a great point. During my time there, heard senior leaders say, answer the question without answering the question. And I disagree with that. I think Congress needs to hear it clear and precise, even if the news is bad. I mean, they've got an oversight role, which is enshrined in the Constitution and in Title 10 and much more than that. They need to hear it loud and clear from the commanders so that they understand exactly what the Air Force needs. My experience tells me that, when you look at the oath of office that we take as an officer in the United States Air Force, the last line is that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I'm about to enter. That's the most important line. It's the line that is the accumulation of the lines before it. And it's also the line that's closest to God. So we have an obligation as commanders, especially, to really do aggressive, founded in truth conversations with the Congress so that we can get winning capability to the warfighters faster than China can, in my opinion. And that requires precise dialogue, truthful dialogue, and trusted dialogue. And those are things I think Wilsbach can provide. And those are things that the Congress, I think, will want to hear. And I think that if we can get those both sides working together, then the resourcing will come.
I think you're exactly right. When I was a programmer a number of years ago, and for those of you who don't know what a programmer is, it's okay. I didn't know what it was before I did it. It was our team, we resourced how we, paid for our force. And so I was in the Combat Air Forces panel. And so we dealt with fighters, bombers, and munitions. And what was beat into my head by my boss and the bosses that I had great bosses, was regardless of how much money Congress gives us, we had an obligation to field the world's greatest Air Force. And what is not in that, and I still believe that, because you can't afford everything, but what is not in there is being very honest with Congress, with the president, with the entire chain of command of, if you want us to do X, Y, and Z, it's going to cost this amount. And we have, you compare what we spend at the national level, for our national defense, you compare it to any other nation, and we spend a lot of money on national defense, but we also do a whole lot more than any other nation. I mean, it's not even comparable what we do. You just look at NORAD. You look at what Canada spends on their national defense and what we spend on our national defense, and who pays for NORAD, who pays for the defense of North America. It's really not Canada. And that's not to knock Canada. It's just what it is. So it's an apples and oranges comparison when you compare us to them. So how does General Wilsbach, he becomes chief of staff, and let's go back to General Brown of 2 iterations ago. And he said, what was it? Accelerate, change, or lose. And I loved it when he said that. He was very clear in his messaging, but I feel like what got lost was the how. He didn't hold his people, his team, accountable for devising the how. What does that really look like?
Yeah. And to me, that's the resourcing that needs to happen. So there's a how for the rest of the command to do. And then there's a how for the senior leadership of the Air Force to do, specifically the secretary and the CSAF. And, I realize I never held those positions, and I realize it's incredibly difficult, and they need to win those conversations. To say it one more time, we need to pay for the Air Force this country needs and deserves, or we need to live with the Air Force we pay for. And we've been living with the Air Force we paid for decades now, and it's showing. When we celebrate funding critical accounts at the 80th percentile, when we have decades and decades old aircraft, specifically my fleet, which I was entrusted with, the mobility fleet is 4 generations behind the strike fleet. The 5th and 6th generation fighters and bombers, and we're still operating the second tanker this country ever built. And while I realize it's an incredibly capable aircraft, it doesn't have the connectivity, it doesn't have the situational awareness, it's got incredible vulnerabilities, and that's just one example. There's more. So we've got to come back and I think really get back to what made the Air Force special in 47. We talked about effects, not platforms. We understood how systems come together, and the integration made us great. I just talked about the 135. It's interesting that the 135 and the B-52 designed and fielded in the 50s are still around because they came together as an integrated team that could do both conventional and nuclear strike, and they were designed together so that they could affect the battlefield and the battle skies the way this country needed it to do, and they're still around. Yet we seem to have wandered away from that approach, and we need to get back to it. I don't want to claim to be Mr. Doctrine, okay, but I have been spending a lot of time with the tenets of air power lately. And the two that we've walked away from mostly are persistence and balance when it comes to the tenets. The persistence, the ability to hold effects over battle space, battlefields, battle skies, and not only create opportunity, but then to be able to follow up and take advantage of it. And then the balance, what the tooth to tail can, we've got an incredibly capable tooth, and I'm really concerned that the tail doesn't have the heft behind it to make the tooth successful. So a little bit of back to basics. I don't want to be the institution we mutinied from in 1947. And we've wandered a bit towards that. We need to sharply go back. And this will be General Wilsbach's number one thing is, even though it could be a 4-year term, hopefully it's a 4-year term, it's going to go by in a blink of an eye. He's got an incredible opportunity that lays before him. And I hope he lines up everything you said and everything we've talked about so far to really get after that action piece in an expedited manner.
Yeah. And he's going to, just to your point, he's going to have to start in the first 100 days. He's going to be very clear on what he wants to do, what he needs to do, and then he's going to have to get after it.
Yeah.
And move forward in that. You talked about the disparity between the tooth and the tail, and I had the benefit of flying both combat forces, meaning combat air forces with fighter aircraft and also airlift aircraft, and I love both of them. And so I have a soft spot in my heart for both of them. And as I look at the combat air forces, the problem we have, and you have a capacity problem in mobility air forces, it's increasingly more acute in the combat air forces. We keep chasing after this technology. We keep chasing after this, demonstrator, and we are giving away the farm on our capacity in order to do that. I always say that sometimes I need a nail gun. Sometimes, I need, exquisite tools to do what I'm doing. And sometimes I just need to call a hammer. Sometimes I just need basics. And the challenge with leadership is deciding which is which.
Yeah.
But overall, maintaining the capacity to do what the nation is asking the Air Force to do, which is what we are not doing. You go back to 1991, Desert Storm, and I think we had 40 fighter wing equivalents. That's a lot of fighters. That's, about 80 aircraft per fighter wing. That's a lot of fighters. Now we're down to, I'm not sure exactly what the number, I think we're about 50 fighter squadrons. So you do the math on that, you're less than 20 fighter wings right now.
Yeah.
And so we've cut and we've cut and we've cut. And yes, we don't have the Soviet Union anymore, but instead we have Russia and we have China and we have all these other conflicts that we keep dismissing, and yet they keep absorbing our forces and just, sucking the life out of our forces with the capacity requirements of those things.
Yeah. Quantity has a quality all of its own.
Yeah.
The toolkit needs to be full. You don't need to go to Home Depot every time you need something new. This is what our elected officials are counting on us to do, right? Is we need to make sure that their courses of action are founded in our ability to do what we've been tasked to do. Not that they think they have something, and then when we actually need it, it doesn't exist. And I think that's where we're, I call it the insidious accumulation of caveats and risk, has accumulated over decades to now we've got foundational missions that need to be done, and yet there's concern about our ability to get it done. So, once again, this gets back to resourcing. This gets back to winning the conversations in the building and on the Hill. Think about right now, if you're in Congress, right? NGAD's on, then it's off, and then it's on again. NGAS is, the keynote speech at AFA, and then it's gone the next year. You just think about this wishy-washy approach to the capabilities you need, and now the people that really provide the oversight and the funding are kind of going, where is the ground truth, Air Force, and where you want to go? And this is where Wilsbach's got in, first 100 days, set that vision, have it bound in the readiness to win tonight. Okay. And hopefully that readiness delivers the deterrence so they never want to take us on. But if deterrence fails, it's an overwhelming decisive victory. And it's got synergistic effects, not just across what air power does, but the joint force and then the coalition. And that's a beautiful place to be. It's very aspirational at this point, but it can be done, I'm convinced.
Yeah. You look at, here's an example that really took the entire Air Force to do, which is Midnight Hammer. That was awesome.
Yes.
And it was awesome at the airman level.
Yes.
It was awesome at the small quantity equipment level. But if we had to do it 2 nights in a row, 3 nights in a row, forget it.
Yeah.
Because we don't have the capacity. Then you put ourselves in an environment like China where people are shooting back, and we have to expect a healthy level of attrition. You don't want attrition, but you can't live in with rainbows and unicorns thinking you're not going to have it. You need to plan for attrition, and we have not done that. And a lot of it, one of the things that I foot stomp a lot is we have focused on technology so much, and so that we spend a lot of money on research and development and on these PowerPoints that we're gonna have, we're gonna have this technology, so we have to cut the existing technology right now and our existing capacity to pay for it. And that is a dangerous road to go down, because to your point, if I'm planning on being ready tonight, I have to have forces tonight. I have to be planning for tomorrow. I have to be planning for next year, but I have to have forces ready tonight, to do so. We are not there right now.
Yeah.
And we continually cut with hopes of that next technology that's going to get there. I'll give one example, and without slamming Lockheed Martin too much, because Lockheed makes great products. But when I was a programmer, and that was when the F-35 that contract was awarded to Lockheed Martin. And I thought it was way better. As an A-10 guy, I didn't want the X-32 to win, because that would have taken away my title as, pilot of the ugliest aircraft in the Air Force, because the X-32 was so ugly. But as capability wise, I'm sure it was a good aircraft, but the X-35, now the F-35, it came with a lot of promises, and Lockheed Martin won the contract in part because of the promises, the technological promises and the logistics promises that they made. And it's been a miserable failure. And it's not all Lockheed Martin. I would say that a large share of it, maybe the lion's share, belongs to the government on how we manage it and how we put it. But there are technological capabilities, weapons capabilities that aircraft should have been fielded with back in 2011, it still doesn't have.
Yeah.
And it's because of the monster that we have in the acquisition and the design test, apparatus that takes us so long to field everything. There's no risk. And we were talking about this on the drive over here. We are so risk averse in getting equipment to the warfighter that we don't get equipment to the warfighter. And at the program level, we're so risk averse, but that risk doesn't go away. We just push it to the warfighter. So now that end game warfighter, that airman on the front line, or that Joe in the foxhole, he's the one stuck with that risk because we haven't got him the equipment that he needs.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. First, industry is a relationship. You nailed that.
Yeah.
It's two sides of the equation. It's just like any other relationship you have where, it takes two to tango, and generally when things aren't going well, there very rarely is there just one side at fault. So we need the Lockheeds and the Boeings and the primes to be successful. They put us in a position where we've had the luxury to enjoy some really amazing kit and capabilities that nobody else will ever have. But we need to get back to a condition in this country where industry can deliver at specs, at cost, and at time, on time. The three things that frustrated me is, an inability to deliver at cost, and it's not just the cost of the platform, it's the cost of when it's late, how much it costs to sustain whatever's holding on for dear life. At specs means that they're delivering on the quality that they promised. And then at specs, at cost, and then time is that it's obviously flowing in on time. So there's a whole lot of quality there. When you talked about Midnight Hammer, it's important to say, and you're right, the execution was phenomenal. Then it was in an uncontested environment against a junior varsity foe that did the ability to recycle that package and do it again, create an opportunity and take advantage of it, will be incredibly challenged. So these are the things that we need to get out. And this gets back to my comment on the tenets of air power and persistence, right? Is that we've got to be able to keep that effect over the battlefield on our timing, our call, our tempo, our will, and not because we can't reset for days or whatever would be to reset it. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement. I think we can get there. We got to decide to do it. I do think it needs to be bound in today. Today identifies risk, and this is what I think we've lost. We lost custody of the risk of the status quo. We all, especially at my level, go through all these mechanisms to account for war plans and readiness, and from the squadron level all the way up to the MAJCOM level. But I think the insidious accumulation of those, we've lost a grip on how many caveats are out there, what it really means to have a weapon system funded at the 80th percentile, what it means, Cruiser was using this example, what it means to go to a bench stock and there not be a bench stock, what it means to have parts that have to be manufactured or pulled out of the boneyard after the break. Those are critical, those stall offensive. You want to look at what our life will be like in the Pacific if we don't get this right, look in Ukraine. That is a war right now with no maneuver. There is no maneuvering happening. They have occasional breakouts either direction, but it's a World War I style trench warfare updated with newer technology. But that's what happens when you can't maneuver. That's what happens when your supply chain can't keep up. That's what happens is going to happen to our American sons and daughters if we're not careful here, should our elected officials choose to fight. So we got to put them in a position where when they pull the trigger on the U.S. military, that it can deliver and not have that be what our future is.
Yeah, well, amen to that. So General Wilsbach, I assume he's going to get confirmed. What does he do? Who does he talk to? Who does he bring into his office to lay out his commander's intent? To say, okay, this is the direction we're going. If I'll be really disappointed if it's status quo, because status quo is not going to work.
Yeah.
I think that was probably one of the biggest problems with the last administration, with General Alvin and his team, is that it was more status quo. And to your point, we're going to have NGAS. No, we're not going to have NGAS. And it was this constant yo-yo of technology and not focusing on what kind of force presentation do we have today and how are we paying for that?
Yeah. Well, I'll share with you the technique I used in Air Mobility Command. And, I was hired into that position because of my experience in the Pacific, not because I flew C-130s with you, but I was hired for my time in the Pacific, which was total about 10 years, 2 tours in Korea, 2 tours at Indo-PACOM, and a tour at PACAF. And, I forecasted this before I arrived. I just put a map on the table and I said, show me what we're going to do tomorrow if the A2 walks in and says it's going down in China. And it was less than satisfying. And so, what started out as a map on a table became a map in a theater, which became a map in a hangar, which became a digital map in a virtual center that added the complexity of what really needs to happen. I had the benefit of coming in after the Afghanistan withdrawal, coming in after the Kabul evacuation, executing support to Ukraine, executing support to Israel and Gaza, executing the withdrawal from Niger. So my operational backbone of, having pretty good situational awareness on how good we were exploding into theater, was a giant concern of mine, especially early. So if I were him, I'd put commanders on the spot in a rehearsal of concept style. I learned this from the Army in Korea and I love it. There's no fairy dusting when you rehearsal a concept. There is just the truth. You don't have a staff to hide behind. You don't have PowerPoints to hide behind. You stand on a map and you say, on order, I will do these things. And what he's got to look for is the integration, the different commands, how familiar they are with each other's needs and capabilities and readiness. Am I going to show up on a ramp like I did supporting Ukraine on an Eastern base where there's a sister service supposedly ready and there's nothing in the marsh and nothing in the cargo yard to move? And are we going to waste a C-17 for 4 days while they get to act together? Or are we actually going to show up and put some power projection downrange so that we can, hopefully deter, but if not, punish? Those are the things that mattered. And once you start building that foundation, it's amazing what opens up as far as your ability to articulate risk, your ability to articulate critical capabilities that you need, ability to articulate what the airmen, and this is what you want to do, you want to empower the airmen at the lowest level that's charged with executing. Those voices come in loud and clear. You get enormous clarity on the task at hand. And once you have that, then your 5 and 10 years becomes much clearer out there as to what the Air Force needs to do.
Yeah, I love that. And I'm thinking about contractors. I have a contractor at my house right now, and I flipped houses for a while. It's like, how much time do I waste going to Home Depot for that part?
Yeah.
And as opposed to having thought it through and planned it and putting all the tools in place right now to be able to get the work done.
Yeah.
And because every time that I had to go to Home Depot, I've got contractors and workers that are standing around waiting for me to get the materials delivered, waiting for me to show up with what they need to do the work. And the last thing we want is airmen waiting around, because they're waiting around while they're at risk. And you've got soldiers on the ground, they're waiting around while they're at risk while we're still ginning up next gen technology or pulling stuff out of the boneyard or whatever it is, because we haven't had to walk through what it really looks like. One of my jobs in the Pentagon also was as a force programmer, I'd go into the WIMP 5 tables. And for those of you who don't know anything about the Air Force, it's this is what our readiness looks like, and this is what perfect readiness looks like. And I remember looking at that going, that's not good.
Yeah.
And because it makes, even back then, it made assumptions about what was effective and what was not effective, what airmen I could actually use to do certain jobs versus what airmen I really needed to do certain jobs, what equipment was really ready to go to the war. I thought we report readiness based on a lot of assumptions and a lot of hand waves of what's going to work when it's probably not going to work. And yes, when you go to war and your life depends on it, you're willing to take more risk and you're going to push a little bit more. But they need to feel that risk right now, even though nobody's shooting at us right now.
I think you're right. Readiness is for me, it was always the remarks section, which I always oriented on. And especially when I received readiness briefs at the MAGCOM level, it's like, hey, the chart's over here. This won't surprise anybody that knows me. I'm not a good chart guy, but I love listening to commanders assess because, you could have a red chiclet that with a commander's gut feel, intuition, understanding of the problem, you actually come away feeling okay with it. And the vice versa is true as well. You could have a green chiclet where once the voiceover comes out, gives you, enormous concern. So, but this does boil down to readiness. I mean, this is a real thing. This is the number one thing. And I thought that Cruiser was articulate about it in his testimony yesterday. But this is about readiness. Can we do what we're obligated to do? And can the country count on us to do it? And there's work to do there. It's probably not just the Air Force. You're a programmer, and normally there's a word ahead of programmer. Heartless programmer is normally the way it's described because it's the real fuel that makes the magic happen for the services. It's not meant as a condemnation of programmers. It's just the books have to balance, right? And there's no such thing as more money. There's only other people's money.
Yeah.
So the money goes to the trusted and prepared.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom line, if you're trusted and prepared, you get the money. If you're trusted and not prepared, you don't get the money. If prepared and not trusted, you don't get the money. And, the Air Force needs to, I mean, this is going to be, I think, a clear-eyed look in the mirror that this new leadership in the Air Force needs to do and say, we've got to be both. And it's not just that they don't get it. It's not even that they don't get it. They get it.
Yeah.
And we've got to get it in a different way to make that resourcing come true.
Yeah. So talking about resourcing, two things that I wanted to talk about is integrated capabilities, command,
Yep.
how we've consolidated fielding equipment into a single command. We kind of had that before with AFMC, and when I was a programmer, literally the MAGCOM, so the major commands who were tasked with providing trained personnel and ready equipment to the warfighting commands, they had the money, they owned the money, and then the air staff was the arbiter between the different major commands. To your point of there is no more money, so we have to balance it, and so there was always some give and take there. That has since disappeared to where those organized, trained, equipped commands, they don't have the money. They get their operations and research and their operations and maintenance money, but in terms of buying new equipment and developing new equipment, they don't have any of that, and they have very little say in it because it's the way it's structured right now. So I'm personally concerned with that. I don't like the way it's set up, and I wanted your opinion on it. And then I want you also to talk about this is kind of an aside, but I think this is something that General Wilsbach can really hammer on is we've got major pass-throughs. The Air Force is funded at this level, but really it's funded about this level because this big chunk goes to not air power. It goes to other stuff, and we've allowed that to happen. I don't understand, other than to play nice with you, I don't know why the chief staff haven't said, I'm not accepting this. You can fire me if you want, but I'm not accepting this.
Yes.
But anyway,
the mission statement of the Air Force should be, I mean, now I get it. This isn't the one you put on the bumper sticker for recruiting, but we've got to put winning capabilities in the hands of the warfighter quicker than China. That at the end of the day is the race we're in. Can we put winning capabilities in the hands of the warfighter quicker than China? That's it.
Which we're not doing right now.
Yeah. And in order to do that, the warfighter voice has got to be the loudest in the room. Period. Dot. The warfighter voice has got to be the loudest in the room. You and I talked about this on the ride over, where I've been in enormous chunks of my career where the warfighter voice is intentionally suffocated in the conversation. And I called it the old silly commander. Oh, silly commander, what do you know? well, I don't know. I'm getting my butt kicked by the enemy. I'm getting my butt kicked by the kit I got. And I'm trying to use the mechanisms in the process to make magic happen, but you're not even obeying those. And so I've got no way to make my mission thrive and my airmen thrive. And certainly in my joint experiences, it's much bigger than just the Air Force. So we have got to create a process that can deliver that winning capability to warfighters, and we've got to make the warfighter the loudest in the room. I'm concerned in that when you create another organization, that's not really getting after the problem at hand here.
Yeah.
We got to make sure that the authorities, the responsibilities go to the cleanest, crispest organization that can get that capability to warfighters. Here's the way I described it in AMC. You can have a process deliver you a product, or you can say, here's the product I want, and I'm going to reverse engineer the process to make it come true. I'm more of that oriented, especially in the short term, where we're not developing new technology that's going to be around, that won't be around for 5 or 10 years. So I think we could agree right now, you and I could go downstairs at the dining room table, and we could sketch out a meaningful Air Force in an afternoon.
Right.
And then, but if you put that in the hands of the normal process, it's going to suffocate it till it's dead in about a week.
Yeah, it gets killed by general officer steering groups. So you have all these people where they're trying to come up with consensus and buy-in.
All the things that a bureaucracy does, the bureaucracies can do real well to suffocate it. Or you can say, here's what we want, and you can go to the staff and you say, you got 6 months, 3 months, whatever it is to make this come true. And I don't care what the process is. I was followed back, especially early in my tenure at AMC, and followed back by people that say, hey, I'm just trying to save you from yourself. Okay, well, that's fine. But, first of all, your tenure here is not going to be as long as you thought, but I don't need saving from myself. I mean, the Air Force can decide whether they need me in it. That's fine. The same thing goes for the most senior leadership of this Air Force. Describe the Air Force we need, and then orchestrate every mechanism to have it come true. And figure out where your red line is in the process on getting the resourcing, and determine whether you're successful and need to stay or not, which was your point.
I would say, am I focused on the process, or am I focused on the product?
Yeah.
If I'm focused on the process, I'm failing.
Yeah.
As a government contractor for many years, we call it the frozen middle.
Yeah.
You get great ideas, you talk to leadership, and you sit down with the staff. Great Americans are trying to do good things, and they get stuck on the process.
Yes.
And they're in the frozen middle, and it just kills me.
Yeah. I talk about this, first of all, I chuckle a little bit when I'm on social media or LinkedIn or something like that, and I see, Igniter for change and stuff. I don't, change is really, really hard. I mean, it is especially, in a system that's been, without tension for a while. I'll be polite and say it that way.
Yeah.
And so when you're reestablishing, it is the hardest thing to do. And so, I look back on history and I just go, the times this country needed extreme change quick, it was a force of personality that delivered. You and I talked about LeMay on the ride over. You could say the same thing about Creech. You could say the same thing about Eisenhower. You could say the same thing about Bill Knudsen, who was Freedom's Forge and drove everything that this country needed at the early stages, pre-war, and then in the early stages of World War II. Personalities that would not let it go, that they were consumed by willing things into existence, withering the internal resistance, weathering the personal and professional attacks. And if you can do those W's, then you can win. But I'm looking for the force of personality that can really drive this. I mean, this is a thing. This is, half the team hates you and half the team loves you type of thing. Boyd is a personality. You think about him and his influence, there's those love and those that hate, but nobody will disagree that he didn't move things forward.
Yeah. My dad was on the air staff with him, and he was a sweater wearing civilian at the time. My dad, I think, was a colonel, and he said he watched him shout down generals in meetings, and the generals would cower because they were wrong. And it's like, I can't argue with correctness. And Boyd was right. And it didn't get him very far in the Air Force, but it got the Air Force, and the combat Air Force in particular, much farther down the road than they otherwise would have been, because he was right. And he was so adamant about his doctrine and about what he believed. And it wasn't like he was arrogant about it. He would, to the earlier point about talking to the lowest common denominator, he had no problem talking through the ideas, and he'd share his ideas with he even talked to the Marines, and the Marines, bought into it. So
Yeah. Well, and I mean, Robin Olds is another great example. It's a force of personality. It doesn't have to be the person at the top. It just has to be well placed.
yeah,
And we talked about Fighter Pilot a little bit. It's my favorite leadership book, and most people don't think of it as a leadership manual, but it talks about,
oh yeah,
again, willing things into existence and withering that internal resistance and weathering the personal and professional attacks. And just a lot of insights into things like that. But we're looking for. I mean, I think the Air Force is still looking for that personality who can, and to a larger extent the DoD, who can drive that integration, who can drive, something, bigger, better, faster. Your reward for more work is more hard work. Your reward for good work is more hard work, and really pick up a pace. I mean, forget the time, whatever the timeline is for China. Mine is, my 2025 call is evaporating quickly. The opening line of my memo was, I hope I'm wrong, and I do hope I'm wrong. But there's 2027, 2035. Even if it was 2035 or later, if you knew that was going to happen, you would be on a war footing now.
Yeah.
To get ready for that. You would want to be, America's sons and daughters deserve that. And we know we're behind. Everybody says it from the president on down. We've got an opportunity now with the executive orders, the absolute value of the executive orders, the absolute value of the DoD memos or Department of War memos, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff statements and memos, all those things show that we are,
there's intent. Yeah.
it's intent and it's product oriented, not process oriented.
Yeah.
And yet, I don't think at all within the building we've taken advantage, and within the services we take advantage of that. I'll give you a chance to come back on that, and then I want to talk about patriotism on industry to kind of round that out.
I would just say I agree with you on that. I don't know that that people get the risk. They don't get what really needs to change, because we have all that guidance, we have the direction. Love Trump or hate Trump, he's pretty clear about what he wants, and he's pretty clear, and he is a product guy. He is not a process guy, and that drives the process crazy. That drives the administration, and crazy. But he is product focused, which should give his team a license to steal and a license to run with scissors on what he has told them he wants them to do.
Yeah, stand on your boss's desk with those documents in your hands and say, what don't you get?
Yeah.
Show I'm ready, and I think that there's some out there taking full advantage of it, and perhaps there's some services taking better advantage than others. But I feel like, the planets have aligned in a way. And I view this as a once in a century opportunity. Yeah. I've said this publicly many times. We were really good on the day after. We were good on December 8th. We were good on September 12th. There's many more examples. Can we be good in advance of the slap across the face and get this done? One of the things I've learned, and I knew this, even working with you during my time at AMC, and certainly now that I've been retired, I'm trying to help companies that have that capability, that winning capability that needs to get to warfighter. And their patriotism is patience with a broke process. That despite the no calls back, despite the double speak, despite being promised money and then no money, despite getting money for innovation and then having nothing behind it on the back end, despite all that, they keep coming back for more. Because they understand what's at stake here.
They do, and they read the paper. They understand what's going on. And I think sometimes as a contractor, especially if you served in uniform for a while or served in some capacity, you step out and you're not consumed by your 60-hour uniform job and the processes and everything that's asked of you on a daily basis just to get to Friday. And you and I know this is true with me, you look at the world writ large and go, we've got problems here. And you love the country even more so. And sometimes you wish you could put back on that uniform and if it would fit. But there is a lot of patriotism. There are a lot of great people. And I'll Chuck Spears at Lockheed and Boeing and all those folks, not because I want them to fail, but because I want them to succeed. And they want to succeed also.
Yeah.
And yet the system is very frustrating because it is process focused.
Yeah. In addition, they're putting their whole, and many times their life savings and certainly personal, professional reputation on the line.
Absolutely.
Based on promises from a bureaucracy. That's a tough place to be. I think you're right. The whole ecosystem needs to work. We need the primes to be successful, and we need the startups to be successful, and we need the new kind of primes, kind of startups that are growing up. We need that whole thing to work. We need programs of record to handle the big things, but we need them differently than the acquisition process was doing now. We certainly need the effects as a service. I mean, there's multiple models out there right now that can do, yeah, but all that contributing to that the now is so expensive we can't afford the future. I mean, this is really, back once again back to resourcing that Willsbach's going to have to tell you is how do you make the now less expensive so that you can afford the future? Because less expensive has to be true, but also more capable has to be right in line with that. I mean, there's a lot of ways to be less expensive, but but losing isn't on the table. So how do we make it less expensive, make it war-winning capability, and then also create the space that we can worry about the future? So this acquisition reform, and I don't, I realize this is a cheesy nuance, but the way I think about it is not acquisition reform, but reformed acquisition. Completely start from scratch. Don't take the old system and just try to, tweak it. Start from scratch, have it run in parallel with effects as a service. And there's probably something in the middle that can give you the resourcing, dependability out of a program or record, but the quickness of an effects as a service would be cool.
There's one comment in that the executive order that I really loved from the president, which is look at cost solutions first. We keep trying to reinvent the wheel and we keep trying to buy something new as opposed to just looking at what's already existing. And that's not the right answer for everything, but it's the right answer for a lot of things. And getting back to, sometimes I sound like I'm a naysayer with technology, and I'm not, because if I look at flipping houses again, I learned really the hard way that if you have a claw hammer and you need a nail gun, you're really going to suffer for it. You buy the right tools and have the right tools for what you're trying to do. Don't sit there and suffer through and make your airmen in this case, or your soldiers, suffer through with the wrong equipment. Buy them the right equipment to do the job properly. But there are ways to do it that we have not been looking at.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the bottom line is we gotta, this again gets that winning capability of the warfighter. We have got to figure this out. I mean, this is to me, the most critical piece. And we've got to do it quicker, which means that I think there is a third line in there, that's going to bridge the gap that hopefully, gives you some. I mean, the best thing about a program of record is the funding dependability. The best thing about effects as a service, to me, is the accountability, which doesn't exist in a program of record. The accountability that says, hey, man, if that contract's not delivering, I'm out. I either bail out of the contract early or I don't renew it, as opposed to I'm committed for a 2-decade journey.
Too big to fail kind of a product.
Too big to fail. Absolutely.
No, I agree. And that was one of the beauties of, you go back to the 60s, the 50s and the 60s with the Century Series fighters, and we cranked out aircraft and new aircraft over and over. And a lot of it was because technology was developing so rapidly, but that really hasn't changed. Maybe the shell of an airframe isn't developing as much, but there's still a lot of technology that's developing rapidly, but we have not figured out how to get back to that of, okay, the F-102 wasn't very good. I'm getting rid of it. And, you produce 300, 400, 600, whatever it was. I'm going to the F-106 and I'm going to, buying a new aircraft. Hey, Convair, that didn't work very well. Do you have something else? Because we're going to end the production line at this number and we're going to get rid of them. We're going to, then give them to Turkey or whatever. So,
I use the iPhone analogy for that, right? I mean, you don't have to buy a new one very often. It gets upgrades. And then when you finally get the beach ball on it that lasts too long, you say, I'm ready for the new one. And that's your approach. And you have no qualms about offloading for a new thing. That's really where we need to do.
And you in your home, you're not searching for that program of record to attach the money to. I need a new phone. I have this requirement. I'm getting rid of this old one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wish I had, to me, one of the biggest things that I was worried about in my fleet in our mobility command is the connectivity piece, to use the iPhone as a segue. I didn't mean it to work out that way though, but the ability for us to operate as a force with unity of effort, all the things that come with that, understand commander's intent and get after the missions that we need to get after. This whole connectivity piece for the fire, we cannot design fighters in the same decade that can't talk to each other. We cannot
by the same company. Because they're separate engineering cores. I'm like,
it's ludicrous.
How did that happen?
And we can't have, the majority of the force not even knowing what's being said. It's a morbid quip here, but as I say, how does a 135 pilot know they've been engaged by the enemy? And the answer is when they wake up in heaven. So, I don't mean to be morbid about it, but it's really true.
It's true. And in the meantime, they've got 64 F-35s around them that knew the entire time.
Yeah.
And those 64 F-35s are shooting their missiles at, whatever's engaging, but they're
Yeah.
probably focused on other targets. And in the meantime, that the KC-135 crew is just literally fat, dumb, and happy until they're a fireball.
Yeah, I'm teasing a new concept called maneuver battle management. Again, I'm not a doctrine guy, but there's got to be, we appropriately focus on kill chain, but who manages the maneuver battle management, which is the 1,000 things that need to happen so that you have the privilege to execute a kill chain.
Yeah.
And, that's also about commander's intent. That's also about sensing and seizing opportunity and risk. That's also about, the agility concepts that all the services has. The Air Force has ACE, the Marines have EABO, the Army has MDTF, DMO for the Navy, how those all come together and we can get to a better place, when it comes to managing that maneuver, because I do believe we're going to really get into, hopefully, deep discussions about maneuvering the joint force, which is where we need to be. We're going to have to think about maneuver. We've been lulled into complacency during our whole career, with permissive lines of communication, and this maneuver under fire, this contested logistics, however you want to phrase it, is going to absolutely be about, can we integrate, can we flex, can we sense and seize? And, the days of the ATOs that were just, like a German train schedule, I think are over. I think we're going to be just like our granddads did.
I think you're right. Well, this has been a lot. We could talk for another 3 hours. We probably should. We'll put everybody to sleep. I'm going to commit you to a follow-up session, because right now we've been talking about where the Air Force is, where the Joint Force is to a lesser extent, and how they can fix it, and what the new Chief of Staff, what we think his first action should be. So we get together in a couple months down the road and do the same thing and say, how's he doing? And, help him from afar as a bunch of, has-beens on what we think is happening, and just give him a little bit of a debrief. And he may listen, he may not listen. Hopefully he's killing it. Hopefully things are going in the right direction, because we need it to be.
Yeah, he's got my full support and my full optimism. I'll do everything in my power to help him be successful, whether he calls on me or not. Our sons and daughters, our great mission, the heritage that we enjoy, not just as Americans, but as warriors in the Joint Force and the Air Force, deserve all of us coming in. It's a chance of a century to get this right. So it's a chance of a century to get this right. And I have full faith that he'll take. And so I hope our next discussion is very positive.
Yeah, we're cheerleaders saying this is awesome. And look how well it's going.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks for having me.
So that's it for today's episode of Commander's Intent Podcast. Head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, or wherever you listen, and subscribe to the show. One lucky listener every single week that posts a review on Apple Podcasts or iTunes will be entered in a grand prize drawing to win a $25,000 private exclusive leadership coaching package with Derek Oakes himself. So head on over to commandersintentpodcast.com and pick up a free copy of Derek's leadership guide, and join us on the next episode.